Let me kind of demo what the feature is, and let's get off Slack here, or not Slack, Twitter, all the same thing. It's noise. Okay, let me go out to laravelshift.com and demonstrate kind of this feature that I was testing yesterday. So Laravel Shift, I'm sure everyone's familiar, but as you can see here, it's an automated service for upgrading your Laravel applications. So of course you can run Composer Update to get the latest packages, but your app code is potentially behind based on changes to the core framework. So Shift kind of gets in there, takes a look, automates a lot of the tedious stuff, saves you time that way. And if it can't automate something, it leaves you cool little comments. So, all right, cool. So what I started doing yesterday, kind of that tweet I put out yesterday, was basically just kind of embarrassingly admitting that I didn't have a lot of tests for, I guess, Shift in general. So yeah, here it is. So I didn't have a whole lot of tests for Shift, particularly the Laravel Shift, the website. I really just test the order flow, particularly the checkout. So, one of 15 features basically was tested. And to be fair, it was the most important feature. But I want to test more features. And so I've kind of made this policy to say from now on, I'm going to start writing tests for anything I touch. So I needed to go in and make some adjustments to the connections section. And so that's what I want to kind of demo today. And in the process of making those tests or writing those tests, I realized a bit of an annoying decision that I made in the past that kind of seemed good, that I thought would be nice to focus on and talk about, how maybe I wasn't practicing Yagni, and use it kind of as a good example to tie together kind of all these practices that you've probably heard me kind of tweet about or talk about at conferences, or even write books on. So, okay, so the piece here is basically this sign in, and when you log in, you can log in with GitHub, Bitbucket, and GitLab. And underneath the covers, this is really just using Socialite, which is pretty easy. But there are some differences based in how I connect, and there are also some other areas of the website. For example, if I go to Shifty Plans and I want to sign up for a Shifty plan, it's going to kind of force me to log in. So there's multiple paths that take me to this login flow. Again, just underneath the covers, it's using Socialite. It's very straightforward. I didn't have to write a bunch of code, but I still have to have kind of these different controllers. And because of the different ways in which the callbacks are handled and the different data that's potentially stored or refreshed or updated, like obviously if you've logged in with GitHub before, I don't want to make a new record. I want to make sure that I'm finding that previous connection to GitHub that you had and kind of logging you in with that one directly to maintain data integrity and so forth. So, but again, because of the multiple paths, because of the multiple Git services and so forth, this kind of got a little bit weird without tests, and so now I want to bring it all back together again. So hopefully the feature makes sense. Let's make sure everything's good with the recording still. I'm getting a little pop in the mic, so let me just check my levels here. Hopefully, if anybody wants to comment back, I'm just going to turn the mic down a little bit because I was getting a little pop back, and I want to make sure it's not coming across crappy. I need to invest in a new mic. So if somebody wants to just throw a comment at me and let me know if this is clear enough or if it's too much gain. Okay, so let's bring up some files. So I want to focus on this GitHub controller and this GitHub test. And I'm going to split these so it's a little easier to see. So these tests, as you can see from the scroll, is absolutely ridiculous. It's freaking huge. It's like a 600-line test, which is kind of my first evidence that something is wrong here, right? This controller is doing too much. There's too many paths and so forth. So it's not too bad. Cool. Sounds good. Okay, good. Not too bad isn't that reassuring. Sounds great. Okay, good enough. All right, we'll keep going. So this GitHub controller is super straightforward. Again, it just leverages these scopes and it gives me a provider name, which is basically the provider that Socialite specs. So again, GitHub, Bitbucket, GitLab. So this controller is very simple. So it's kind of like, well, why would I need 600 lines of tests for this? Well, I don't. Um, they extend an abstract class. And this kind of right away was already a bit of a smell to me when I was coming back and looking at it. But, again, I wrote it a while ago, so I'm not going to judge too much. But there's two main components in here. There's this redirect to provider, which is basically all SocialLite needs to do. Again, I'm just loading up the driver based on that name. I'm registering some scopes to make sure I get the proper access to the repository. I need to do something a little bit special if it's Bitbucket. This was a little gotcha. I actually noticed that SocialLite, when you call scopes, it appends these, but Bitbucket actually, there was a default scope from SocialLite that you have to turn off. Otherwise, Bitbucket was having a little bit of trouble. So, again, older version, this may not be necessary anymore, but again, without tests, I'm leaving it as legacy code, and now's my chance to refactor. So, and then I basically just redirect to the proper GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket, access OAuth page, and then basically it calls back this handle provider, and I basically just try to get your user data. If I couldn't, you get redirected back to authenticate to try again, and then I do some creation of a user if necessary, and then we get all to the private methods down here that kind of handle those fancy things. So at a high level, this doesn't look that intimidating, right? I mean, this is pretty straightforward. It's about 15 lines of code. Most of it's just kind of handling any potential redirections based on your path, and the rest is just kind of registering these scopes. And same with the handle callback. I really just try to get your data or your user data to build your account. I create it if it's needed. Again, you may have logged in before, so I don't need to create a user account. And then I redirect you based on, again, potential redirections that were stored up here. So pretty straightforward as far as the happy path. And I have tests, again, for all of that. So let me condense this just so you can kind of see, again, the level of tests here. So we have redirects, the redirects to subscription, the redirects to product, and then I start handling the callback handler. And then there's dozens of this callback handler basically to handle all those different paths through those private methods because there's a lot of logic inside of here. And that's really what I want to address in this refactor. There's a lot of branching that's happening. And even though at a high level, this, on the surface of the water, everything's really nice, like underneath, underneath the surface, there's really a lot going on down here. And again, that became evident when I started writing tests for all these different paths. I mean, look at all these callback tests. And again, tests are great. I'm not saying, not have the tests. I'm just pointing out that the fact that I was writing so many of these and also the setup for these, if we take a look, for example, just at kind of, again, the happy path, the setup for these as well. So not even how many, but how much I'm setting up to kind of get through. Now, some of this is a consequence, in my opinion, of integration tests. And I know Laravel kind of focuses on integration tests a bit more than maybe other PHP frameworks might, or other languages even in general will. You have the whole big JB Rainsberger, integration testers scam kind of propaganda. So I'm not necessarily on that extreme, but I do think that these tests are by nature going to have just a little bit more setup because, I'm mocking things out or I'm faking certain facades. I'm building up, different things through model factories and so forth. So I think, in fairness, this is a tougher example because of the swapping of the facade and having to do mocks, and because of the setting up of the factory, the data with data factories and so forth. So we'll get more into that in a second. And again, there's also just a lot of assertions to really kind of feel very confident of like all these different things happened again, because there's a lot happening in this controller. So kind of enough there. Let's take a breath and get a little drink. And so this is where I want to start. So what I want to start with, first of all, the thing that really bothered me is that there was kind of a smell here that I mentioned before, and the smell is basically a lazy class or a weak class, and I'm not sure if that's actually the proper code smell. So code smells, weak class, I think. Let's find kind of like the original one. There's kind of like, I know there's one, and it might be kind of like, here it is, lazy class. I think that's what I'm after. Yeah, so perhaps the class was designed to be fully functional, but after some refactoring, it's ridiculously small. Yes, exactly. So They're near useless. Inline the class, okay, is basically the treatment. So what we're getting at here is we have this lazy class, not a weak class. It's a lazy class. And so let me show you what this looks like in the real world of my application. But this was kind of the smell that got triggered in my head. And it's evident again by the fact that, I have all these tests, and when you go and look at something like the GitHub controller, look how lazy this is. Like, it gives me a provider name of GitHub, which is technically in the URL for the callback, and then it registers some scopes. And if we look at the others, so if we look at, Bitbucket and GitLab, let me bring these up. If we look at GitLab, look at this one. It's completely lazy. It's just the provider name, okay? Like, it's ridiculous to use their own terminology. Like, it's ridiculous. And then Bitbucket, same thing, just this. And then in fact, it doesn't even use scopes because it already has that custom logic inside of the service provider. It already does this special bit here where it blanks out the scopes. So it's kind of like not even really using what some of these other classes are using. So this is a common example, not only for abstract classes, but also inheritance. And I know it's tough because, as someone who has a computer science degree, like these were the pillars of object-oriented programming that I was taught. I'm taught like you have to do inheritance, and you want it because of encapsulation, and you want to separate these things. And then of course you got the whole, don't repeat yourself working against you. Everybody tells you don't have code duplication and don't have these inline if checks, but now I have these three classes that I have to keep up with. I have this abstract definition here in this Git service that's actually doing all the work, which makes it a little unclear when I'm actually writing this test, because this test, I can't test the abstract class directly. I mean, I can test it directly, but I would have to either mock it or do some reflection to kind of get it to work the way I want. I wouldn't be able to really test all the way through, which means I have to write kind of a concrete, if you will, a concrete GitHub controller test, which means that now, technically, if I want to test GitLab and Bitbucket, if I want to do it right, quote unquote, I need to copy this controller, or sorry, this test, change everything to GitLab, update the test just slightly for its variations, and now I have another 600 line test for this class only because I've used this inheritance. So again, I kind of beat a dead horse there, hopefully, but the point is that these are just lazy classes. So what I want to do is inline this. I want to make the refactor I want to do is I want to inline these just as kind of outlined on the lazy class treatment here. Components that are near useless should be given an inline class treatment. So I consider these absolutely useless because, again, GitLab, this only method that exists on here, can be determined from the route URL. When I click on, GitHub, connect, or whatever, if we notice, it's probably too small, but if you notice in the status bar down at the bottom, we can see that it's going to go to auth/GitHub. If I go to Bitbucket, it's going to go to auth/Bitbucket, and that's my URL. So I can determine from the route this provider name already. So this is completely useless, right? So the only thing I really have in here is just a property, and that property is only used in 2 out of the 3. So it just doesn't really hold its weight. So I want to collapse these, get rid of this abstract class, and basically turn this into a Git service controller and test it directly. So let's start writing some code. Feel free to throw across any questions before I kind of get knee deep into the refactor, but that's the plan. And if anybody kind of disagrees or they want to know more why, shoot me some questions and I'll try to take a look. But let's bring up the web PHP. And the first thing I want to do is, I don't want to kill the other stuff. So this is kind of a refactor step that I do. Some people would go in here and just like blow these away. I don't want to do that yet. I kind of want to make mine in its own little isolated world. This is kind of a Martin Fowler thing that I picked up from his book Refactoring. I basically want to kind of make the change that I want, and then I'm going to go back and kind of destruct the other change. So you kind of are like, if you will, you're swapping out the engine while the car is running, right? So technically, if I deployed this, I don't have anything pointing to this new route just yet. So let's do git, and I'm going to do auth, and here I'm going to do basically, what do we call this? The service, I think, provider. So let's do provider, and I'm going to capture that, and that's good enough for here. And I'm going to go back and add validation to this later, but technically speaking, as long as the 3 that I care about are here, which will be tested, it's okay with me. So, and then I want to change this basically to the Git service controller. And let's do another one for the callback as well. All right, so let's change this to provider. And now I have this set up appropriately for just that Git service. Now this isn't going to run just yet, but before we do that, again, before I go swapping out my test, I want to make sure we're in a green state. So let me go back to this GitHub Controller test. Let's run this. Okay, we're all green. This is my test currently, right? 13 tests for just those two methods. You know, a lot of 111 assertions. I mean, there's a lot going on here. So all good. But now what I want to do is basically, I know that ultimately this is no longer going to be used. So I'm comfortable here going ahead and kind of blowing this away. So I'm going to just do some refactoring here with PHP Storm. So let's do git service controller. And we'll do that. And I'm going to change the name of the file, of course. And then what I want to do in here is anywhere where I'm doing like GitHub, that's actually okay. Let's start with GitHub. So I don't want to go changing those just yet. So let's focus on this kind of happy path. So it's still going to go to like the right location, which is off GitHub. That's fine. So let's see if these actually work. Okay, so test feature GitHub controller test. Oh, well, of course, I renamed it. So let's do git service. Cool. Okay, so we're still green, which is somewhat surprising. Oh, there's overlap. It's actually finding this one. Okay, so let's do two things here. First of all, I renamed this incorrectly. So let's fix that. I like to have that test suffix. And then I think it's capturing this particular provider first. So let me just comment that out to make sure that we're actually going to this provider bit here. So let's try this again, because I would definitely expect some hardcore failures here. I mean, for the first part, like, I try to guess how a test is going to fail potentially. But for the first part, like, that's an abstract class. I shouldn't be able to call it directly. So I definitely should get a PHP exception. So the fact that it was all green was a little bit weird. There we go. That feels a little bit better. Okay, so we got a whole bunch of crap here. We got 200, but or we wanted a 200, but we got a 500. So I'm going to turn on that without errors. So let's do the without exception handling, just so, you know, instead of getting kind of this nice stuff, I'm getting a little bit better of an exception. Because again, I would expect that I can't do an abstract class exactly. So it's not instantiable. Okay, so let's fix that. So step one, let's turn this into a legit class. We extend controller, all good. And then what's it complaining about here? Add method stubs. What stubs are we missing? Let's just see what PHP Storm says. Get provider name. Okay, well, I don't need this anymore, to be fair. So let's kill this abstract bit. And somewhere in here, I need to change out, at least for this top one, this get provider name. So again, I haven't changed any tests. I know these tests work, so some people might be thinking, well, why didn't you change your tests? I really like to treat tests as a mathematical equation, right? So my tests are testing my code, and my code technically is testing my test, right? They create this, this symphony, right, or this symbiosis where they have to work together. It's a cyclic relationship. So I don't want to change anything in my tests at this moment. I want to start changing my actual implementation to get it to pass. Because I know that this worked for a GitHub controller, and now I'm just collapsing everything. So I haven't started testing for Bitbucket or GitLab just yet, but the point of the refactor here, just kind of what we'll probably go through, is really just kind of getting this to run no longer as an abstract class. And then there's one more small refactor I want to point out. And then I'll kind of clean up the rest on my own. So let's get rid of this provider name for here for now. And what we can probably do is just get that request parameter, right? So what is it? Route param. What is getting the route parameter? Oh, there it is. You can just say route param, I think. Yeah, let's do that. Provider. I could probably pass it in up top too. That would probably be a little bit cleaner, I think, if I did provider here. But let's do this route param just so we're explicit for the moment. Let's run this. So we still have an exception. And I think there's a way to limit the test I want to do. Is it like -- filter? Nope. Maybe not. Oh, it kind of filtered it. Redirects to provider. Oh, there's just a couple of these called redirect to provider. So it actually did filter it. Cool. Okay, well that's a little bit better. Method get service get provider name does not exist. Okay, so somewhere else in here I'm still calling get provider name. Here it is right here. All right, so let's just keep copy pasting this until it works. And let's dump this back out down here. And again, we're only focusing on this first test for now. So, oh my gosh, everything passes. Successful refactor. That's pretty awesome. Awesome. Okay, cool. So to be fair, that's somewhat expected because again, this worked for the GitHub controller. I just packed everything back down and I pulled in provider. So now what I want to do is I want to make sure this redirects and does things appropriately for these other two paths because again, I used to be in a situation where I was going to have to copy this GitHub controller test and make it a GitLab provider test and then a Bitbucket provider test. And I just didn't really want to go down that road. So this is the whole thing that led me to this refactor. So for now, I'm actually going to add some more tests for this, which is a little bit, silly. I could probably use a data provider or something along those lines, but because the setup is slightly different, I need to make sure that this actually gets all kind of packed down correctly, so to speak. So, what's interesting though is actually this user repo bit. I would have expected that to fail looking at this more closely. So it says should receive scopes with args and then with these arguments, user, email, and repo. Now it didn't get those. It wouldn't have known to get those from anywhere because scopes for the get service is all right here. So that's a little bit interesting. It's a little bit interesting that that worked. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to kill this GitHub controller now that I'm on the right path and just see, just for sanity, like I want to make sure this is not being tested anymore. It's not being hit somehow. So let's do this. Okay, whoops, that was my fault. So redirects to Bitbucket provider. Everything's still passing. This is a little bit strange to me because, again, this driver scopes, it shouldn't be receiving user, email, and repo just yet. So I would have expected that to fail. So why isn't it? Let's do this. Let's just DD something here and see what these scopes are. Because there's some kind of weird magic going on here. Yeah, see, it's not even getting in there. Which means it's not being called. Oh, I see what's going on here. This is a little trick with Mockery. So I set it up to be called, but it actually wasn't called. So that's a little bit interesting. So let's make an assertion down here for our top one. Just another assertion to be super clear. So should have, whoops, it's not this, sorry. It's driver should have received a call to scopes, and basically with, or no, the second parameter is the args. So I need to take this and bring it down here. And now I'm expecting this to fail. There we go. Okay, method scopes, blah, 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 should have been called, but called. So called at least 1 times, but called 0 times. I love Mockery's exceptions. They're so fucking terrible. They should spend just like 10 minutes and like make those a slightly more human readable, like improve the developer experience. So what's interesting is that because this didn't have any return values or anything, again, the combination here of the mocks and the swapping of socialite and so forth make this very gray area where it is an integration test, but it's kind of like some parts of it are being, kind of mocked out. So yeah, things were passing, but I was missing an assertion. So I don't really need both of these. So what I want to do here is I want to do a couple things. First, I want to change this driver to a spy because I don't want to have to mock everything necessarily. Because if you're not familiar with mocks and spies, let me just run this for a second. So it basically has this ability to be called, right? But if you kind of don't set up an expectation, what's called an expectation, so if I don't say like either you should receive this or you should have received this, then Mockery kind of craps out if it ends up getting called. So in this case, it's probably fine because it's actually not getting called, but here in a second, once we kind of drive it to get in there, I think we're going to get a different mockery error. So again, just to kind of call what we're doing here. Okay, so let's drive this through to kind of, again, finish this one piece here for the different pieces, or the different providers. Okay, so now that we have GitHub, we don't have this scopes really anymore. And again, let's just kind of see where this is being used. So it's only used here. So there's kind of no reason for this property anymore because it's kind of, at this point, it's basically self-contained to this top level method. So only redirect provider uses scope, so there's kind of just no reason to do this anymore. So what I want to do is I'm just going to turn this into kind of an else if here. So let's just say if request is GitHub, again, I want to just do the simplest possible thing here, right? I don't necessarily need to do a bunch of stuff. And since we killed that controller, I'm going to steal it from my test. And so basically, if you are the GitHub provider, then I want to get your user email and I want to get repo access. I want to make sure to add these to the scopes. So let's run this. And we're getting some errors still. So here we go. So mockery2 scopes does not exist on this mock object. So again, kind of calling my shot here. This is one of those things that I expected because it's a mock. And with a mock, you have to explicitly define kind of all the things that end up kind of getting called with it. Now, I'm in a bit of a conundrum here because what's interesting is that I could turn this into a spy. And if I turn it into a spy, then it's going to stop complaining about that. And the spy basically allows me to just let this thing run as it would. And basically, you know, just whatever it does is kind of going to be like a no-op operation underneath the covers with mockery. But I can later, at least kind of, because I spied on it, I can test to see if certain things were called in certain ways. So this should actually alleviate the problem. But it introduces another problem, and it's one that you probably wouldn't pick up, so I want to take a second to point this out. Because I spy on something now, I'm not as rigid. I'm kind of just listening for whatever happens, and I'm kind of keeping track of whatever happens. So what I want to point out is actually, I'm just going to kind of forcibly break this, and I'll write a test for this later, but I want to demonstrate why I was a little reluctant to turn that into a spy right away. So when we do this, basically, we get a 500, and it basically says, oh, sorry, we didn't finish this out. Let me just change this to something that's not, you know, an invalid variable. So notice that our first test is still passing. And that's a little interesting, right? Because I kind of did something, I did a little bit of a side effect under the covers here. So because I'm using a spy and not a mock anymore, I don't have that rigidity, and therefore I can call other things randomly on this driver. Now maybe that doesn't really matter to you. It might not matter for your code, but I've kind of contrived example here of why this does matter, because basically I could call this set scopes now and just blow away all my scopes, and I never had a test for that, and technically all my tests passed because I did call this, but maybe I, you know, fumbled something up and called something over. So I try not to write tests that are like super defensive. Like I don't write a bunch of tests that go down like all the possible negative paths because there's just an infinite amount of those, right? But given the choice between a spy and a mock, and the alternative of maybe having my test be a little too loose, I would actually prefer the mock, is the point. So let me change this back to a mock, and let me actually mock it out. And we're just a real simple one-liner. I'm not gonna get super technical on like its args. I'm just gonna say, look, you can call scopes. And later, obviously, we're gonna test that you called it correctly down here, right? Okay, so let's run this back. And now we get an exception, and ideally that exception is, hey, set scopes doesn't exist. Good, well, I never wanted to call that anyways, and it shouldn't exist because I mocked this thing out only for the things I knew it would need, and that's actually part of my test, to be fair. So now we're back to a total passing state. So let me pause there, see if there's any questions that come across. Looks like we still got some people, thumbs up. I know, how do we see the comments here? View 6 comments. Oh, cool. Okay, good. So throw any questions my way. And I guess if there are any questions, cool. If not, let's make a decision here. Do you want to see me drive out the Bitbucket and GitLab, and then we'll kind of just stop the live stream there? Or do you want me to kind of, everybody feel good about that, and do you want me to go on to maybe what my other refactor would have been or will be? I'll give you all a second because I know there's a lag. I'm going to get a drink. Maybe there's a lot of lag. Or maybe I don't get comments anymore. I'm so alone over here. Sad. All right, well, no comments. Or at least really, really lag. Keep going. Trask, you're so generic. What is Keep going. Which part? I gave 2 questions and you said yes. The other refactor. Okay, cool. There we go. We got a vote from Andrew. Thank you, Andrew. Okay, let's go to the other refactor. So I think we're all pretty clear that like I could basically do the redirects to Bitbucket. I could test that flow, collapse that class. I could do GitLab, which actually had no customizations. So that one's going to be super easy. So let's jump ahead to the other refactor, and then if people want to fall off and kind of see, give people the opportunity to fall off if they want, and then I'll come back to these if people still want that. So keep your input coming across. Again, I know there's a little lag. Let's look at this other piece though. So there's two pieces that I didn't like down here. Okay, so the first piece is real simple, and this doesn't have any tests for it, so it's actually something I purposely didn't test because I'm going to end up moving the location of this. So this is a little bit buried in here, but basically this create user if necessary. I actually go in and test to see if your connection already existed. So the real world use case of this is that I log into Shift with my GitHub account, and I come back 2 weeks later and I log into Shift with my GitHub account again. I don't necessarily want to create that account multiple times, so that logic's here. But like I said, there's a lot of different things that actually end up coming through this controller, and that's kind of part of the problem of why it has so many tests. So another area that comes through the controller are these connections. And so basically you can add multiple connections. So once you're logged in, you can actually add a connection to your work GitHub account, to your private GitLab account, whatever you need to do so it makes your Shift, account more robust, easier to do so you don't have to log in and log out all the time, right? You can just log in with GitHub and it's just going to find all your other connections, right? It's a feature I think that got launched last fall, but it kind of helps with, again, that team, the fact that developers probably have multiple repositories that they're shifting, potentially multiple accounts for work. I obviously have all 3 accounts on all 3 platforms, and in fact, I have multiple accounts because I have my personal one plus also the Laravel Shift account on all 3 of these providers. So the point here is that you can add another connection here and you get that same modal, which filters you through that Git service controller. So again, it adds yet another path that can get there. So all of these paths are creating, again, the fact that I have 600 lines of a test. So I didn't actually stop. The 600 lines are just the login portion. So the point is that this refactor is that in here I noticed a to-do that said redirect back to connections. So technically if I added another connections here, I get redirected to my dashboard. I don't actually get redirected back here. And I could have thrown yet another session variable to capture that and do all the things and yada yada, but it's just a little bit silly. So what I decided was I'm actually going to take this controller, pare it down to really just be adding a connection. So it's really a much, much tighter controller. And at that point, in fact, I even have the opportunity to maybe reuse certain pieces of this and do it in a different way. So that's kind of the second refactor that I'll just kind of verbally hint at, was the fact that I came through here and realized that there was a missing path effectively. And instead of coding it in here with even more, branching logic and so forth, I'm not going to do that anymore. The other thing too, and kind of little hints at that, is that sometimes in here, I'm actually checking to see if you're already authenticated. But again, if I knew that the responsibility of this particular Git service controller was simply to log users in, then I would never need this path, right? And that's going to start eliminating some of the tests that I have. So again, by kind of determining what does it mean to be these different paths, again, here's another branch where I check for if you're authorized or not. The point here is that we know now using this just as the auth route, right? Just for this and not trying to piggyback all these other pieces. Like I'm just using this now. I'm not going to use it for adding connections anymore. I'm going to just have the connections controller handle those callbacks appropriately. So just a hint at another refactor that's going to allow me to kind of eliminate tests here. I'm paring this back down by inlining it and getting rid of cruft where I know I can by kind of just some old clues, but also by, again, the same logic of like paring this down to where, I just don't need to have all these extra classes. It's just weight in my application. It's kind of more files I visually have to look at. And again, they were lazy. They didn't have a lot in them. So that's the first refactor. The second refactor goes back to, that was the second refactor. The third refactor goes back to this line specifically. What kind of bothers me, again, about this kind of push a little bit towards the integration tests is just, again, the amount of setup. And admittedly, this is one of the more complex, because of the code I wrote, one of the more complex paths. So again, not a knock on Laravel by any means, because with the factories and the swapping of facades, it does make it relatively painless. But because of the way I'm writing some code, some of these things just, again, add a little more setup. So for example, if I want to test that, I think I have this in here. Let me just go ahead and bring this test up. I want to test, where is this? Callback restores. So yeah, I have a test for a authenticated user. So this is potentially one we can get rid of, right? But the point here is that I want to make sure I test this particular line. Well, this isn't so easy, right? If we go and look at this, to test this, right, even though it's a public method, to test it appropriately through this controller, I would either need to find a way to mock it out so I can just assert that you called it with the right values, which is a very unit testy type thing to do. And again, kind of puts us in this hybrid land of mixing integration versus unit, or like strict unit mocking, so to speak. So that is an option, but it's a static method. So it's kind of like, well, now I have to make it an instance method and I have to like inject this through the controller and have it be bound by the container. And that's just like so many steps, because it's just a nice little one-liner here. So I got to thinking, okay, well, how can I refactor this? How can I refactor it? I could just test the happy path from this test perspective, and then I could write tests that test this more robustly for all of its other branching paths, right? So that is an option. I could basically just say, look, whatever the user connection user was got stored as a database preference. So I can just simply do something like assert database has user preferences this particular key, right? But again, I kind of don't like that. I'm hesitant to do that because I'm testing something that's not really a primary action of this particular controller. So getting to possible solutions, I thought, first of all, well, you're actually logging in here. So it is possible that this login piece actually kind of digging down a little deeper. Login's actually not here. Anyways, the login method actually fires events that you logged in, right? So I could actually have a login event that just gets fired, and in fact, this user preferences class could listen for login events and then do the appropriate thing, which is basically to default these values. So this is potentially a better approach, and more explicitly, I could just do something like, event, fire, or whatever the fanciness is these days. What is it, dispatch these days? Or it's just a one-liner helper, isn't it? I don't use events a whole lot. Let's see if it comes up with it. No. I think you just fire an event with event. Yeah, I bet you this is it. Yeah, dispatch an event. There we go. So we can just use this global event helper. So anyways, I could just fire an event here, and that's basically just like, provider, like a provider login event, right? Or maybe stick with kind of the Laravel convention of like the dot notation. So I could do this, fire that off, and then listen for it on the other side. And now I've kind of decoupled those in a way where I could just fake out the event. I could swap out the event facade and just listen that that event was fired with, a particular bit of, connection user data, right? So that's a little bit cleaner, right? Because now I'm not necessarily forced to test these other things. I'm not forced to like do all this like container binding for such a simple static method. I mean, again, if I were calling lots of things here, I would lean a little bit more towards the event. So I haven't jumped to it just yet, but just some ideas again for those future refactors, just to kind of complete the whole picture of everything else I would want to refactor in here. So haven't decided on this yet. Again, I might come back to it here in a little bit, but it's just that line that kind of bothered me. So feel free to throw across your questions or challenges on that. But that was kind of the final refactor I was after, is like, how do I want to handle kind of this particular happy path? So I'm going to control Z a lot of this stuff just to kind of get back to a place where we can continue down the road of packing down those lazy classes. All right, yeah, that's far enough. All right, we got the auth check back. We got our if check down here. We still got this wrapped in if, and then we're back to a point where we've got this provider Bitbucket test. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the top here. Again, pause for a quick drink. I'm going to go about 10 more minutes, and then we'll kind of stop there. So let's just see what we can get with this redirects Bitbucket, just to kind of demo some of this stuff a bit more. Okay, so let's just make sure we're back in a passing state. We are, but now we need to appropriately test Bitbucket. So I'm going to change anything in here that says GitHub to Bitbucket. I'm going to run it. And I would have expected a failure, but we didn't necessarily get one. So let's check this out on why. So again, this is the problem where we basically copied this before we set up the rest. So let's fix that same mockery stuff. And let's say, look, you're not going to call scopes anymore. You actually should have called set scopes. And we need to make sure that you actually called it. So we stubbed it out, but maybe we didn't actually end up calling it, right? So again, I can stub something all day long, but if I'm never calling it, like, no one's the wiser. So I need to make an assertion that I actually called that with the appropriate bits of information. So I want to call set scopes now, and I basically want to call it with an empty array. Cool. So it should have received that. It's funny, it actually should have received set scopes with an empty array. Mockery's got like a very weird syntax. So if you look at should have received and you actually dig a little deeper down, it takes args as an array of arguments. It's kind of not like variadic, which would be really cool. Maybe future versions are. I don't know. I might be on an older version, to be fair. But yeah, I wish it was just variadic and lined up with, like, the method signature over here is what I'm getting at. So the fact that it doesn't kind of annoys me. And the fact that everything's passing also annoys me. Oh, because we're not testing the redirects to Bitbucket provider. Our filters being too filtery. Let me bring this to the top of the screen, make sure everybody can see it okay. All right, so let's get the proper filter here so we're testing the right test. There we go. Okay, cool. So driver null either was unexpected or its arguments. Okay, cool. So we got some issues here with set scopes. Set scopes came back the right way. Driver, well, maybe I read that a bit too fast. No matching handler found for mockery driver null. And which line is it complaining about? Somewhere deep in here. Controller test 78. 78. Okay, so it's actually just not calling correctly. Interesting. Test driver redirect, set scopes. Let's just see if mockery is being weird. Sometimes again, those error messages aren't so clear. Nope, it's me. No matching handler found for mockery driver null. So it's claiming that when it asks, it's claiming this is null. Why would route provider be null? We set up Bitbucket. Oh, crap. We're getting bit by these old school routes again. Let me just comment all of them out. There we go. Okay. So when I have some weirdness happening like that, I like to just, again, for a sanity check, I like to go back and just kind of uncomment something or comment something that I know would break. Okay, here we go. Perfect. So we're getting the right place now. Again, just a sanity check. So let me recap that here. Went a little quick, possibly. So because I still had the old Bitbucket controller, it was actually still hitting it, and therefore provider was never never working out correctly. And because this was just extending that class, it all kind of still just worked. So we're at a place now where we're far enough down this path. I do want to just go ahead and delete these old ones. I don't need their references anymore, especially not the GitLab controller because it was empty anyways. So good. So we're back to failing. We don't need the web routes up anymore. Let me uncomment that, and we're good. And we know that if we were to try to call something like scopes, because we left this as a mock and not a spy, that it would, mockery would kind of help catch us here and basically say, look, you called scopes and you never set that up. So good. So we're pretty strict here. All right, so let's do the last one for GitLab. And GitLab should even be a little tighter than this because we don't need to really do anything with scopes. So we can actually tighten this really far up. Okay, so let's get rid of the scopes completely. And let's get rid of this test for scopes. And we will change all things Bitbucket to GitLab. And you know what? Let's just do one more thing here. Test. I'm going to do test just to vary the test data up a little bit. I'm going to do a test GitLab driver redirect. Let's run this. Oh, let's get rid of our filter. So redirects to, let's filter that. And we've got a few failures for order. So let's just GitLab. There we go. We're green. Okay, so let me recap this again. So I just wanted to change, obviously we changed this to the GitLab provider. I also just wanted to vary the redirect kind of data up again because I don't want to be in a place where like someone could just kind of be a jerk and, you know, do like test, test redirect provider, right? Like we had before. So if we vary this up, it's one of those things where it would actually take more code to kind of make that you know, not work than just work the right way, so to speak. So, and I'm going to change it here too to just Bitbucket and GitLab. So let's do that again. Let's do Bitbucket, Bitbucket. Cool. And let's do one more here for this. Whoops. And this is GitHub. Cool. And I think that will complete our refactor and packing those down. So that's all good. Let's test Bitbucket just specifically. All good. And let's test GitLab. Oh, sorry, GitHub. No tests executed. Oh, I didn't rename this one. Perfect. So let's be symmetrical here. So GitHub. There we go. And if we just do all the redirects, again, we're going to get a little bit of noise for those last two tests because I haven't finished the order creation redirect just yet. But the point is that this is all good. So now that we know that the tests are good, I'm just going to look over this one last time and then we'll call it quits. Everything's nice here, so these if statements are good. I have tests for those. The route parameter, I'm cool bringing that in. I could possibly try to refactor this real quick to take provider here. And let's just see so we don't have to like do this request bit. Let's see if this is just auto magic. I think it is. Good. Okay, still the same two failures, but just to be clear, GitHub still works, GitLab still works, Bitbucket still works. Great. Okay, and that's just a little cleaner again, in my opinion, because I just don't want to. I don't want to have to do like that chained method, and you know, it's very Laravel just to pass the parameters in. You know, tons of the resourceful methods do stuff like that. So. Okay, let's keep going down the list. So we clean that up just to say provider a little bit. We have this check now to make sure your GitHub do this special thing. You're never going to be both of these, so I'm just going to tighten this up with a else if, just to kind of, again, make that a bit, make that a bit tight. Else if is all one. And then we'll redirect ultimately. So again, let's just go through. All right, there we go. So there's the refactor. We basically took a poor decision early on to be fair, it was an OOP decision. It seemed like the right decision to break those out. But again, it's one of those common examples of where Yagni could have been called. Our developer brain, said, oh, let's make these classes and make this an abstract definition and we'll overwrite these few methods. And earlier in time, there might have been a better reason for that. But over time, we saw how we developed a code smell of lazy class for those three different pieces. And so what once made sense now actually packed down, technically speaking, to less code. Not only less code because it was less classes, but actually less code in implementation detail because now we get a little bit tighter with this provider. We don't have the method signatures of get provider name. We can pass it directly in. So we get our dynamicity through the routes. And some people might be saying, oh, well, shouldn't we lock down the routes to just be these three providers? I could, but honestly, what's going to happen when you do a provider that doesn't exist, right? Like nothing. So I'll probably write a test to lock them down to make sure that you're not doing something else. And again, we can simply do this with the route, right? I'm sure there's a route regex. I'm pretty sure I remember seeing back in the day that you could do to lock these down to where it can be like GitHub or Bitbucket or GitLab, or I can just make something explicit in my route service provider on what provider has to be as far as that little placeholder. So I'll probably go ahead and do that again just for sanity. But at the end of the day, you could just leave it because as long as I know my three work, I kind of don't really care if you tried to throw something random in here. Although, I guess if you did hit one of the real ones like Facebook, you could log into Shift with Facebook, technically speaking, if you hacked it the right way. So yeah, I'll probably end up locking that down. Shoot over some final questions. I'm going to go ahead and kind of make a rough commit here and give you all a chance to send those across. But otherwise, all good. Thanks for joining. If you liked it, definitely hit me up on Twitter. Let me know. Just post to this or the shared recording later, and maybe something I'll do on Fridays or something like that. So yeah, thanks again. Get some good feedback so far. Let's go ahead and make this commit while I'm just kind of letting everybody fall off. So I'm going to do git-add-p because it's just my favorite. And I want to review all these changes because we went kind of quick and I was demoing and yada yada. Okay, so it's no longer an abstract class. I don't need the doc block because it's old and technically outdated. It's not Bitbucket anymore. We threw in the provider. That makes sense. Pack this down to use provider. Just clean that up with if statements that overlapped. Looks like just some formatting here. Again, the provider name's old, but we're going to fix that. And we got rid of the abstract definitions. Makes total sense. Commented out the routes, added the new ones. We renamed this to get service controller test. That makes sense. I can get rid of this method exception thing. I'll come back to that. Just all the setup here are new tests. All good. There we go. So that makes sense. I could go ahead and whip this up and I'll clean it up later. But I'm going to keep going here. Thank you all for joining live. And again, let me know and maybe we'll do this again.